Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'll be presenting the South China Sea arbitration between the Republic of the Philippines and the People's Republic of China. In the interest of time and to simplify the conflicting claims of the parties to the dispute, it is just important to note that China grounds its claims on historic rights, in essence the nine-dash line, while the Philippines claims that the international law rules prior and with the UN Convention for the Law of the Sea, or UNCLOS, or the Law of the Sea Convention, does not permit the claims of China, and therefore China's activities in the area are illegal. The international law concepts to note in this case are maritime zones, sovereignty, and sovereign rights. Looking at the maritime zones, the baseline is where you start to measure your zones. Basically, the farther the zone is from the baseline, the less rights the coastal state has. From the baseline up to 12 nautical miles, the coastal state has sovereignty in the area called the territorial sea. This means that the coastal state has absolute jurisdiction and control in this area. Generally, passage, access to ports, and other activities must comply with coastal states' laws. From the end of the territorial sea up to 12 nautical miles is the contiguous zone. The coastal state only has jurisdiction over fiscal, immigration, customs, and sanitation matters in this zone. From the end of the territorial sea up to 200 nautical miles is the exclusive economic zone, or the EEZ. The coastal state has sovereign rights, mainly involving resources in the zone. To be specific, sovereign rights over the exploration, exploitation, conservation, and management of living and non-living natural resources. Also, there are sovereign rights as to other activities like environmental protection, marine scientific research, and artificial island building. Other states enjoy freedoms like the freedom of navigation and overflight, so long as these are not incompatible with EEZ rules. The coastal state also has sovereign rights under the EEZ, the seabed and the subsoil, also called the continental shelf, extending also to 200 nautical miles. The coastal state has sovereign rights to explore and exploit natural living and non-living resources in the continental shelf like oil, natural gas, minerals, etc. And as to areas where there are no national rights are the high seas or waters beyond national jurisdiction, which is open to all states so long as activities in it are for peaceful purposes. And underneath the high seas is the area. It is the seabed and subsoil beyond national jurisdiction, whereby exploration and exploitation of resources are subject to the International Seabed Authority, or the ISA. These are all important to note because these tell you what a state can and cannot do. Another important provision in the convention is the regime of islands. An island is an area of land, so size does not matter, naturally formed, so not constructed by humans, surrounded by water, and above high tide at all times, so it is a high tide elevation. If the island cannot sustain human habitation and economic life on its own, then it is a rock. If a high tide elevation is a rock, then it can only project a territorial sea and a contiguous zone, so no EEZ and no continental shelf. If a high tide elevation is not a rock, then it is a fully entitled island that can project all the maritime zones, i.e. the territorial sea, contiguous zone, EEZ, and continental shelf. In the interest of time, I will not be discussing the jurisdictional matters of the case and will be moving forward to the ruling. So as to the ruling, the legal issues put forward by the tribunal concern: number 1, the historic rights as to the nine-dash line; number 2, the status of the features in the South China Sea; and number 3, the repercussions of Chinese activities in the South China Sea. The tribunal defines historic rights as the assertion by a state of a right at variance with the convention, acquiescence therein by the other state parties, and the passage of sufficient time to establish beyond doubt the existence of both the right and a general acquiescence. To break this down, there are 3 important concepts to note, namely the right at variance with the convention, the acquiescence by other state parties, and the passage of sufficient time. First, the tribunal notes that China's nine-dash line claim is at variance with the convention. By ratifying the convention, however, China's nine-dash line claims, which overlap the EEZ of other states, were extinguished and superseded by the provisions of the convention. In other words, China may not anymore assert historic rights claims on the maritime zones of the other state parties. Second, the 9-dash line is not accepted by the other state parties of the convention, specifically the state parties that have maritime zones which overlap the 9-dash line, like Indonesia, Vietnam, Malaysia, the Philippines, and other states. Third, the 9-dash line, which was revised and was not uniform throughout time, was only finally official in 2009. Hence, the tribunal saw that the passage of time was not yet sufficient. Therefore, the tribunal rules that the 9-dash line has no legal basis under international law. So going to the status of features in the South China Sea, the tribunal, citing expert findings, rules that there are low tide elevations and high tide features in the South China Sea. As to the low tide elevations, these do not generate any maritime zones. And while the tribunal finds that there are high tide features, these, however, are all rocks, incapable of sustaining human and economic life on their own. Thus, none of the features are islands, meaning these features are incapable of generating an EEZ or continental shelf. Therefore, these features belong to the coastal state that has a maritime zone overlapping them. Looking at the maritime entitlements of China under the convention, these features lie outside the maritime zones of China. Looking at the maritime zone entitlements of the Philippines, these features are within the 200 nautical miles EEZ of the Philippines. So, as to the Chinese activities in the South China Sea, China has been exploring and exploiting the natural resources of the aforementioned features. Chinese activities not agreed upon by the Philippines in these features are illegal. Therefore, China has breached and failed to exercise due regard for the sovereign rights of the Philippines over living and non-living resources. And also, number 2, it breached its obligations to protect the marine environment. And number 3, it violated dispute settlement procedures by aggravating the dispute. To sum up the decision, the tribunal finds that number 1, the 9-dash line has no legal basis under international law. Number 2, there are no islands in the features listed in the case. And number 3, Chinese activities in the area are illegal. However, it is also important to note that although there is an issue of sovereignty, the Philippines repeatedly requested the tribunal not to rule on sovereignty and boundary delimitation, as this will complicate the jurisdictional matters of the tribunal. To simplify, the case does not draw lines on the map, whether one feature belongs to China or the Philippines, but rather the subject matter will only focus on the maritime entitlements, the maritime zones, and not the boundaries between China and the Philippines.